The Father's Justice. My name is Robert Hayes, and I've spent most of my life believing that when something breaks, there's always a sign, a warning, a small fracture before the collapse. That morning felt ordinary enough, the kind of quiet, predictable start that doesn't prepare you for anything unusual. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee cooling untouched beside me, sunlight stretching across the counter in that familiar way it always did, when my phone rang. It was my mother, Dorothy Hayes. Now, my mother doesn't call without a reason. Not at her age, not with the kind of steady, measured habits she's kept her entire life. So the moment I saw her name on the screen, something in my chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, just that quiet instinct that something, somewhere, had already gone wrong. I answered immediately. She didn't waste time with small talk. No good morning, no gentle lead-in, just my name, Robert, spoken carefully, like she was testing the weight of it. And then she asked a question that shouldn't have meant anything, but did. Did Evan's boy have his graduation party already? There was a pause, just long enough for something cold to settle in. Caleb had just finished his first year. Evan and Sophia had been talking about that party for weeks, the kind of event they mentioned often, almost proudly. A big house, a nice deck, everything carefully presented. I had assumed we'd be invited. I had assumed my mother would be too. She's his great-grandmother. She taught him card games. She remembered every birthday, without fail. People like her don't get forgotten. It was last weekend, I said slowly. Why? And that's when she told me. Simple, calm, almost casual. They had it, Robert. And no one called me. No anger, no accusation, just a quiet statement. And somehow, that made it worse. Because in that moment, I felt something shift. Not loud, not explosive, but precise. Like a piece of a puzzle snapping into place where it didn't belong. They had organized the whole thing. The celebration, the gathering, the photos, the speeches, and they had done it without her. Without Dorothy Hayes. I didn't react right away. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, staring at the counter, at the coffee I hadn't touched, feeling that familiar growing tension settle into my chest. The kind that doesn't come from what you see, but from what you start to understand. Because this wasn't about a party. It couldn't be. And somewhere, deep down, I already knew. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Something planned. Something deliberate. They hadn't just forgotten her. They had chosen not to include her. I didn't have to wait long for the rest of it to surface, because my mother rarely calls with half a story. There's always a reason she speaks when she does, and more importantly, there's always something she already knows that you don't. I asked her what had really happened. Not the version Evan and Sophia would eventually try to explain, but the version that slipped through the cracks. And that's when she mentioned a name I didn't expect. A woman from her church, someone who had been at the party. Not close family, not important enough to be part of anything private, which made her the perfect witness. She had called my mother the day after, casually at first, talking about how nice the event had been, how beautiful the house looked, how proud everyone seemed of Caleb. Normal conversation, the kind that wouldn't raise any concern on its own. But then her tone shifted, just slightly, the way people do when they're not sure if they should be saying something. She mentioned meeting someone there, a very professional young woman, she said, someone who didn't quite fit the rest of the scene, not a relative, not a friend, a lawyer. She remembered that part clearly, not because of what was said, but because of what was carried. A leather folder, the kind people bring when they're not there to celebrate anything. That detail stayed with me, because people don't bring legal documents to a graduation party unless the party isn't the real reason they're there. According to her, at some point during the afternoon, while the music played outside and the younger crowd stayed on the deck, a small group had quietly moved inside the house. No announcement. No explanation. Just a shift, subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but obvious if you were paying attention. The doors closed. The atmosphere changed. And for nearly an hour, No one saw them. When they came back out, that's when things stopped making sense. Evan looked different. Not upset exactly, but unsettled, like someone who had just been told something he wasn't fully prepared for. His movements were slower, his smile forced, his attention drifting. The kind of look you don't fake, because you don't even realize you're showing it. And then there was Sophia. She looked the opposite. Composed, bright, completely in control. Her posture sharper, her expression lighter. Almost satisfied. Not relieved, not surprised. Satisfied. Like a plan had just reached the point she had been waiting for. Like something had gone exactly the way she expected it to. That contrast, that difference between them, was the first real confirmation I needed. Because whatever happened inside that house, it wasn't spontaneous. It was prepared. And suddenly, that party, the invitations, the timing, the missing call to my mother, none of it felt accidental anymore. It felt arranged, carefully, deliberately. And for the first time since the phone rang, the question in my mind changed. Not what happened, but why. I've spent a lifetime fixing problems that don't look like problems at first. The kind that hide behind normal routines and polite conversations until you step back and see the pattern. And standing there in my kitchen, phone still in my hand, I started doing exactly that. Stepping back, laying out the pieces, not emotionally, but logically. Because if you strip away the noise, the story was already there. A graduation party, carefully planned, talked about for weeks, and yet my mother, Dorothy Hayes, wasn't invited, not forgotten, excluded. A lawyer present at what should have been a family celebration, carrying a leather folder. A private meeting inside the house, doors closed, conversations no one else heard. Evan coming out unsettled. Sophia came out composed, almost pleased. None of that happens by accident. None of that is casual. So I asked myself the only question that mattered. What would require that level of coordination, that kind of timing, that much secrecy? And the answer came faster than I expected. The house, the land, the trust, everything tied to Dorothy Hayes. My father had built that trust decades ago, quietly, methodically, the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself. No flashy accounts, no public displays, just assets that grow over time because no one wastes them. Land outside the city, long-term investments, accounts that most people would underestimate if they saw her standing in her kitchen, answering a landline like it was still another decade. But I knew better. I had seen the paperwork. I had watched how carefully it had all been structured, not just to exist, but to last. And more importantly, to be protected. Because a trust like that doesn't move unless someone makes it move. It doesn't change hands unless someone forces it to. That's when the last piece locked into place. If you can't access the assets directly, you don't go after the assets. You go after the person controlling them. You question their judgment, their capacity, their ability to manage what they own. You don't need to prove they've done something wrong. You just need to suggest they might not be able to decide anymore. And suddenly, everything about that afternoon made sense. The lawyer wasn't there to celebrate Caleb. She was there to evaluate. The private meeting wasn't a coincidence. It was preparation, a discussion, a strategy, maybe even the first step in building a case. Because once you introduce doubt about someone's mental clarity, once you start using words like oversight, protection, best interest, you're not helping them. You're positioning yourself, positioning to take control. And Sophia Hayes, with that controlled smile, that careful way of speaking, that ability to guide a conversation without ever raising her voice, she wasn't reacting to an opportunity. She had created one. Evan, I could already see it, hadn't fully understood what he was stepping into. His hesitation, his discomfort. That wasn't guilt yet. Not entirely. That was confusion. The kind that comes when someone you trust frames something wrong as reasonable, as necessary, as smart. But this wasn't protection. This was a move. Calculated. Patient. and built around one assumption, that Dorothy Hayes was someone they could outmaneuver. I set the phone down slowly, the realization settling into something solid, something undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bad communication. It wasn't a family oversight. It was a plan. And now that I could see it clearly, the only thing left to figure out was how far they had already gone, and how much they thought they could still get away with. What I didn't know yet, what I hadn't even begun to consider, was that my mother was already ahead of me. While I was standing there, piecing things together as it had just started, Dorothy Hayes had already seen the entire board. That's the thing about her. She doesn't react loudly. She doesn't rush. She simply moves, quietly, precisely, and always before anyone realizes she has. The morning after that phone call from her friend, while I was still trying to understand what had happened, she got dressed, got in her car, and drove herself into town. No hesitation, no discussion, no asking for help. At 81, she walked straight into a law office like she had done it 100 times before. And she didn't walk in confused. She walked in prepared. She told me later, in that same calm, measured tone she's used my entire life, that she had already connected the same dots I was just beginning to see. The lawyer at the party, the private meeting, the shift in behavior. She didn't need confirmation, she needed verification. So she sat down across from an estate attorney, looked her in the eye, and laid everything out without emotion. Not fear, not anger, just facts. And then she asked the kind of questions people only ask when they already know the direction of the answer. Who had been contacted? What had been filed? What steps could be taken? What steps had already been taken? There's a difference between someone trying to defend themselves and someone preparing to close a door permanently. And everything about the way she moved, the way she spoke, told me she wasn't trying to react to a threat. She was eliminating it. The attorney made calls, quiet ones, professional ones, the kind that doesn't leave room for interpretation. And it didn't take long for the picture to sharpen. Names came up. Contacts were confirmed. Intentions, clearer than anyone involved would have liked. And through all of it, Dorothy remained exactly the same. Calm, steady, composed in a way that isn't passive, but controlled. Because she wasn't surprised. That was the part that stayed with me. She wasn't trying to catch up to what was happening. She had already anticipated it. She had already considered the possibility that someone, even family, might look at her life, her assets, everything she and my father had built, and see, not a legacy, but an opportunity. And instead of waiting to see if that would happen, she had prepared for the moment it did. When she called me that morning, it wasn't to ask for help. It wasn't even to inform me. It was to bring me into something she had already set in motion. There was a moment, right before she hung up, where her voice shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I did. That quiet edge, that almost imperceptible certainty, the sound of someone who already knows how this ends. And in that moment, I understood something I probably should have remembered sooner. They weren't dealing with an elderly woman they could manage. They were dealing with Dorothy Hayes, and she had already made her move. By the time I sat across from Dorothy Hayes at her kitchen table, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was verifying. There's a difference between suspicion and clarity, and that morning clarity arrived in pieces, precise, documented, impossible to ignore. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. She simply told me what had been confirmed. Names first. A law firm out of West Des Moines, an attorney, retained quietly, not for consultation, but for action, not to review options, but to initiate a process. And that process had a name I knew all too well. Mental competency challenge. I didn't react right away. I just stared at the table, at the faint scratches in the wood that had been there for decades, trying to reconcile the words with the people attached to them. Because once you understand what that means, what it actually involves, you don't hear it as a concern. You hear it as a strategy. They weren't trying to help Dorothy. They were preparing to legally redefine her, to question her judgment, her memory, her ability to manage her own life, and if that challenge gains traction, even for a moment, control shifts. Not permanently at first, just enough to open the door. Oversight committees, temporary guardianship, financial supervision, words that sound protective but function as leverage. And leverage, once established, rarely stays temporary. Dorothy explained it all without raising her voice. The attorney she had met with had already confirmed the contact, already verified that Evan and Sophia had taken the first steps. Consultations. Document gathering, early stage positioning, not filed yet, but close enough that it wouldn't have taken much to move forward. That's when the full picture settled in. The party wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of a case. The lawyer wasn't observing. She was evaluating, and every decision after that, every delayed phone call, every carefully timed visit, every word about concern or structure, it all pointed in the same direction. Sophia Hayes hadn't improvised this. She had built it, layer by layer, quietly enough that no one would question it until it was already in motion. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to anger. Not loud, not explosive, but controlled, focused, because this wasn't just disrespect. This was calculated. They had used Caleb's graduation, his moment, as cover for a legal maneuver against his own great-grandmother. They had smiled for photos, poured drinks, welcomed guests, while behind closed doors, they were discussing how to take control of everything she owned. And Evan, that was the part that stayed with me the most. Because according to what Dorothy had learned, his involvement wasn't as clear-cut. His name was there, his presence confirmed, but the depth of his understanding, that was harder to pin down. The hesitation I had heard in his voice, the unsettled look described at the party, it all started to make sense. He hadn't led this, but he had allowed it. And sometimes, that's enough. The room went quiet for a long moment after she finished. Outside, everything looked the same. Same street, same house, same ordinary afternoon. But inside, everything had shifted. Because now there was no uncertainty left. No misinterpretation. No benefit of the doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding between family members trying to do the right thing. This was a legal move. Structured, intentional, and already in motion. I looked at Dorothy, expecting at least a trace of frustration, some sign that this had affected her the way it should have. There was nothing. Just that same calm expression, steady, unreadable, almost patient. And that's when I realized something that changed the entire situation. Sophia may have started this, but she wasn't the one in control anymore. Not even close. They chose Thursday afternoon. Not too early, not too late. The kind of time that feels deliberate without looking staged. I saw their car pull into my driveway before they even reached the door. Evan stepped out first, shoulders slightly tense, movements slower than usual. The posture of a man who had spent days rehearsing something he still didn't fully believe. Sophia stepped out a second later, composed, controlled, the same measured confidence I had seen for years. Only now I understood exactly what it meant. I opened the door before they knocked. Evan tried to smile, and for a second, it was real. "Dad," he said, stepping forward, pulling me into a quick hug. There was hesitation in it, not distance, but weight. Sophia followed with a polite greeting, her tone warm, balanced, carefully neutral. "Robert, thank you for seeing us." I nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in." We moved to the kitchen table, same table that had held decades of conversations, most of them simple, none of them like this. I poured coffee. No one spoke right away. The silence wasn't empty, it was measured, like all three of us were waiting to see who would make the first move. Evan went first. "We wanted to talk to you about Grandma Dorothy." I leaned back slightly, hands resting on the table, voice steady. "Then let's talk about her." He glanced at Sophia, just for a moment. And that was enough. That one look confirmed everything I needed to know. Not control, but influence. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. When she spoke, it was smooth, almost reassuring. "We're concerned, Robert," she said. "She's alone in that house, managing significant assets without any oversight. At her age, that can become complicated." Season. There it was. Not an accusation. Framing. I held her gaze. Complicated for who? A small pause. Not long, but noticeable. She hadn't expected resistance, that direct. Evan shifted in his chair. "Dad, it's not like that. We just think there should be some structure, some protection in place." "Protection," I repeated quietly. "From what?" No answer. I let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then I spoke again. "Is that why there was a lawyer at Caleb's graduation party?" The air changed instantly. Evan froze. Sophia didn't, but something in her expression tightened. Not panic, not yet. Just calculation adjusting in real time. "It wasn't like that," Evan said quickly. "She was just Emily Johnson," I cut in, my tone calm. "Estate attorney, leather folder, private meeting inside your house, doors closed for almost an hour." Silence. Sophia set her cup down carefully. "Where did you hear that?" I didn't answer her question. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, just enough to shift the balance. "What was in the folder, Sophia?" Her composure held, but only just. "Robert, I think you're misunderstanding." "Daniel Pruitt," I said. That was the moment. It was small, almost invisible, but I saw it. The flicker, the instant where control slipped, where preparation met something unexpected. Evan turned toward her, confusion replacing whatever certainty he had walked in with. "Daniel who?" And just like that, the structure cracked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The attorney you retained to begin a competency challenge against my mother." Evan's expression changed completely. Not defensive, not angry, just stunned. "What?" Sophia spoke quickly. "We were trying to protect the family." "No," I said, still calm. "You were trying to position yourself." The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't controlled. It was unstable. I let it sit there, let them feel it, before continuing. "She knows," I said. "Dorothy knows everything. She was in her attorney's office days before you got here, and whatever you thought you were building, it's already gone." Evan looked down at the table, jaw tight, processing. Sophia didn't respond. She was still calculating, still searching for an angle that no longer existed. And for the first time since they walked in, I realized something clearly. This wasn't their conversation anymore. It was mine, and I was done letting them control it. There's a moment in every situation like this. A quiet shift where the balance of control becomes impossible to ignore. Up until then, Sophia Hayes had been operating under one assumption, that she was ahead, that every move she made had gone unseen, unchallenged, and uncontested. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't have predicted, was that Dorothy Hayes had never been behind her in the first place. I didn't rush the next part. I didn't need to. Timing matters more than volume, and the truth lands harder when it arrives without warning. "My mother has already made changes," I said, my voice steady, measured, to everything. Evan looked up immediately. Sophia didn't move, but I saw the tension settle into her posture, not visible to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but there, subtle, controlled, but tightening. "What kind of changes?" Evan asked. I held his gaze for a moment, then answered plainly. "Her estate, the trust, the property, every account connected to it." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't uncertainty anymore. This was an impact. "She met with her attorney early this week," I continued. "Everything has been reviewed, updated, restructured, legally binding, filed, notarized." Sophia's composure held, but only on the surface. Her fingers shifted slightly against the table, a small, involuntary movement, the kind that happens when control starts to slip, and the body reacts before the mind can compensate. "That doesn't change anything," she said finally, her tone still calm, but thinner now. If there are concerns about her capacity, those changes can be challenged. I nodded once. That's already been addressed. Another pause. She completed a full cognitive evaluation, I said. Independent, documented, thorough, memory, reasoning, decision-making, all assessed. The report confirms she is fully competent to manage her affairs. Evan blinked, processing. Sophia didn't. She was still, but now it was different. Not composed, contained. The report is attached to her estate filing, I added, which means any attempt to question her competency won't just fail, it will collapse immediately. That was the moment the structure gave way. It didn't happen loudly. Sophia didn't raise her voice, didn't lose her temper, didn't break down. That's not who she was. But something in her expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. The certainty was gone. The quiet confidence she had walked in with, the sense that she could guide this conversation wherever she wanted, it disappeared. Because there was nothing left to guide. No opening. No leverage. No path forward. Everything she had been building, every careful step, every calculated move, had been anticipated, intercepted, and closed before it ever had a chance to become real. Evan leaned back slowly, one hand moving to his forehead, the weight of it settling in. You're saying, there's nothing we can do? I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do the work. Let the reality reach him without interference. Then I spoke. I'm saying she already did everything. And that was the truth. This wasn't a defense. It wasn't a reaction. It was a conclusion. Dorothy Hayes hadn't just protected herself. She had ended it. Completely. And for the first time since they walked into my house, Sophia Hayes had nothing left to control. Sunday arrived the way storms do. Not with noise, but with pressure. You feel it before anything happens. A quiet weight in the air that tells you something has already been set in motion. When I pulled into Dorothy Hayes' driveway that afternoon, the first thing I noticed wasn't the house. It was the cars. Evan was already there. That wasn't surprising. What was the second one? Caleb's. I sat in my truck for a moment longer than I should have, staring at it, understanding exactly what that meant. He hadn't been told. Not everything. Not the truth behind that party. Not what had been planned in the background of his own celebration. And now, he was here. That wasn't a coincidence. That was design. I stepped inside without knocking. You don't knock at Dorothy's house. Family doesn't. The air inside was warm, steady, filled with the kind of quiet normalcy that only she could create. The smell of food, something slow-cooked, familiar, comforting in a way that felt almost intentional. Dorothy stood at the stove, moving with that same calm precision, as if nothing unusual was happening. "Robert," she said without turning, "hang your coat. Dinner's almost ready." Her voice was light, controlled, completely ordinary, and that's what made it unsettling. Evan sat at the table, already waiting, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting too still, like he didn't know where to put them. Caleb sat beside him, relaxed, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the tension surrounding him. There was something almost disarming about it, that natural ease, the kind that only exists when you don't know you're standing in the middle of something important. Sophia sat across from them. Perfect posture, calm expression, that same composed presence she always carried, but now it felt different. Not confident, not dominant, just maintained. Like she was holding on to something that had already started slipping. I took my seat without saying much. There was no need to fill the silence. Dorothy handled that effortlessly. She asked Caleb about his classes, about his professors, about the small details that make up a normal life. He answered easily, laughed once or twice, completely present in a moment that, for him, was still just a family dinner. For the rest of us, it wasn't. Evan tried to follow along, nodding, responding, but there was a delay to everything he said, a half-second behind. The kind of hesitation that shows when someone is carrying more than they can keep hidden. Sophia contributed when needed, polite, measured, never overstepping, but never fully relaxed either. And Dorothy, she controlled the rhythm, every movement, every question, every pause, placed exactly where it needed to be. She wasn't reacting to the moment, she was guiding it, quietly, invisibly, like someone arranging pieces on a board that had already been set. Dinner was served. Plates passed. Conversations continued. From the outside, it would have looked perfect. A family gathered, a grandmother cooking, a grandson is laughing, nothing out of place. But underneath, everything was in position. Every person exactly where they needed to be. Every truth waits at the edge of being revealed. I watched Dorothy as she moved back to her seat, folding her napkin with that same small, precise motion I had seen before. It was subtle, almost insignificant, but I recognized it now. That was her signal. The moment she decides the waiting is over. And as she looked up at the table, at Caleb, at Evan, at Sophia, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't dinner. This was timing. And the board had already been set. The moment didn't arrive with noise. It never does when Dorothy Hayes is the one in control. It arrived quietly, in the middle of something ordinary. A pause between bites. A shift in posture so subtle that only those paying attention would recognize it. She set her fork down, folded her napkin with that same precise motion, and let her gaze settle gently on Caleb. "Caleb," she said, her voice warm, almost affectionate, "I have something for you." He looked up, surprised but smiling, still holding on to that easy, unguarded energy. "For me?" She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out an envelope, cream-colored, sealed. Nothing dramatic about it, no weight, no visible importance. And yet, the moment it touched the table, everything changed. The room didn't go silent, but it narrowed, as every detail had suddenly become sharper. "Open it," she said. Caleb hesitated for a second, glancing briefly at his parents before tearing it open. I watched his expression carefully, the way it shifted in stages. Ablake. First curiosity, then confusion, then something slower, deeper. His eyes moved across the page again, more deliberately this time, as if trying to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. "Grandma, this is a check?" "It is," Dorothy replied calmly. He swallowed. "This is a lot of money." "Your grandfather worked very hard," she said, "and so did I. This is for you, to finish what you've started, to build something that matters." Evan leaned forward slightly, tension already visible. "Mom, we didn't know about." "There's a condition," Dorothy continued, not raising her voice, not even looking at him. Caleb blinked. "Okay. It goes into an account in your name only," she said. "Not shared, not managed, yours." The words settled into the room like a weight. Sophia's posture changed first. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The stillness is becoming rigid. The control is tightening around something that was already slipping. Dorothy reached for her glass, took a small sip, and then set it down with that same quiet precision. "I've also updated my estate," she added. "Everything has been restructured, properly documented, legally secured." Evan's voice dropped. "Mom, I'm not finished," she said gently. And that was enough to stop him. "I've completed a full cognitive evaluation," she continued. "Independent, comprehensive. The results are attached to my filings. According to Dr. Howell, my judgment is quite clear. The tension of my essay. No emotion, no emphasis, just a fact." Then, she looked at Sophia. Not sharply, not accusingly, just directly. "I know about the attorney," she said. The room froze. "I know about the meeting during Caleb's party," she continued, "and I know what was discussed." Caleb turned slowly, his expression no longer confused, but focused. "What meeting?" No one answered him. "What are you talking about?" he asked again, quieter this time. Dorothy's expression softened as she looked back at him. "Ask your parents," she said gently. "I think you deserve the truth." That was the moment everything broke. Evan couldn't hold it anymore. The hesitation, the uncertainty, It all collapsed into something heavier. He tried to explain, tried to shape it into something reasonable, something protective. But the words didn't land. Not here. Not now. Because Caleb was listening. Really listening. "You used my graduation?" he said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was worse. Flat. Clear. Final. Sophia tried to step in, her voice controlled but strained. "We were trying to protect." "You used my graduation," he repeated. And this time, there was no space left for anything else. No justification. No framing. No strategy. Just truth. And the realization that came with it. He looked at her, not with anger, but with something colder, something quieter, the kind of understanding that doesn't explode. It settles. The kind that changes how you see someone permanently. Evan lowered his gaze. Sophia didn't speak again. And Dorothy, she didn't need to say another word. Because the truth had already done what it was meant to do. It didn't just expose what had happened. It ended it. By the time the front door closed behind Evan and Sophia, the house felt different. Not quieter, not lighter, just clearer. Like something that had been building for days had finally reached its natural end. Caleb didn't leave with them. He stayed, sitting at the same table, the envelope still in front of him, his hands resting beside it like he hadn't fully decided what to do next. Dorothy moved through the kitchen the way she always did, steady, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. She cleared plates, adjusted the tablecloth, poured fresh tea. Small, ordinary actions that somehow carried more weight than anything that had been said earlier. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of victory, just control. Quiet, complete control. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the fading light settle over the yard, letting everything replay in my mind, not the confrontation, not the tension, but the precision. The way she had waited, the way she had allowed everything to unfold exactly as it needed to, without forcing it, without raising her voice, without ever losing her position. Caleb finally spoke, his voice softer now, more grounded. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," Dorothy replied gently, placing a hand over his. "And you're not responsible for what other people choose to do." There was a pause, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, just honest. I looked at him then, really looked. The confusion was still there, but something else had taken its place. Understanding. Not just of what had happened, but of who people can become when money, control, and opportunity start to blur the lines between right and wrong. And that was the part that stayed with me. Because what happened here wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic collapse. Just decisions, quiet ones, made behind closed doors, and the consequences that followed when those decisions were exposed to the light. Dorothy didn't win by fighting. She won by being ready, by understanding that sometimes the strongest response isn't immediate, it's prepared. Money can change how people see the world. It can shift priorities, blur judgment, even rewrite loyalty, but it cannot create respect. And it cannot replace the truth, no matter how carefully someone tries to position it. As I picked up my coat and headed for the door, I glanced back one last time. Dorothy and Caleb were still at the table, talking quietly, something steady and real between them. No tension, no strategy, just clarity. And I realized something then, something simple but easy to forget. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the moment before everything is set right. So let me ask you this. If you were in that position, would you have acted sooner or waited the way Dorothy did?